man's character is his fate. Heraclitus. Good morning, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, wandering author, coming at you from the northeastern side of Nashville on Two Rivers Bridge, which goes above the Cumberland River, I think. Anyways, today we're going to continue our discussion of the Nichomachean ethics. Currently, it is starting to rain a little bit. I am visiting my friend who's walking ahead of me slightly. He's a drummer, and he's holding my skateboard. So, hopefully it doesn't start raining too hard, but as you guys remember, the Nichomachean ethics is it's a practical treatise. Aristotle is writing this to try and inform the leaders of his time. And for the Greeks, ethics is about achieving eudaimonia, not just being a moral person, but how to be a happy person, literally. So it's very practical. And in the opening sequence of the Nichomachean Ethics Book 2, Aristotle says, virtue being, as we have seen, of two kinds, intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue is for the most part both produced and increased by instruction. So he defines morals and virtue into two categories, those intellect and those of moral virtues, which is really habitual. An intellectual virtue is something that can be taught, but to develop a moral virtue like courage, you have to actually do things in order to achieve that, right? Now, he believed that virtues belonged to those two classes, like I said, intellectual and moral. And moral habits are the result of consistent action, which is where it gets tied into character, because habits are what build our character. And Aristotle says, for no natural property can be obtained by altering habit. So he says that we're not born with moral virtues, although every man possesses the capacity for them. So these are things that we have to cultivate inside of ourselves. They're not necessarily natural. So something that is natural is chasing pleasure and avoiding pain, which Aristotle also says is the underlying motivators for all, or most of humanity's actions. And I can agree with him. I mean, I'm sure if you consider your own life, most of the time you're either motivated by the pursuit of pleasure or by the avoidance of pain. And normally avoiding pain is the more powerful of the urges. So, the virtues we acquire by first having actually practiced them, just as we do the arts. We learn an art or craft by doing the things that we shall have to do when we have learnt it. So this right here is in the first part of Book 2, and Aristotle's talking about how we develop these things, and he compares it to like a builder. So for men to become builders, what do? They build things. For a person to become a harp player, they play the harp. For a person to be a guitarist, they play the guitar. To be brave, you do brave things. To be just, you do just things. And he spends the second half of the book just kind of defining how we come about these things and how we know what the right choices are to make. And for Aristotle, the right choice is always the mean between two extremes. So he says, we have no choice but to be molded by our experiences or actions, for a bad builder is made by building badly. So if you're not actively practicing positive virtues, you are cultivating a negative character, at least in Aristotle's eyes. And then at the end of chapter 1 of book 2, he says, hence it is incumbent on us to control the character of our activities, since on the quality of these depends the quality of our dispositions. And he moves on and literally has a quote. He wants to talk about how we act rightly, which is funny. My dad always talked about acting right. So the Greeks and people in Alabama still have something in common, I suppose. So then he goes on, and in chapter 2 he says, we become temperate by abstaining from pleasures, and at the same time we are best able to abstain from pleasures when we have become temperate. So remember from our discussion on Stoic virtues that temperance is really like self-restraint. And what he's saying here is all mankind have the capacity to practice these things, and we get better at them when we practice them. So if you're regularly abstaining from pleasures, you're going to get better at controlling yourself. That's really what he's getting. So do the hard thing, because the hard thing is going to get easier if you're doing it often. And then he goes on to talk about what exactly qualifies. So you could do something that's virtuous by accident, and it's really not a virtuous thing. Think of like somebody who claims to be a lover of God or something along those lines, but they're really like, kind of assholes to people. they were still dealing with that back then. And he says, an index of our disposition is afforded by the pleasure of pain that accompanies our actions. So what he's saying is, if we look at the stuff that pleasures us and the stuff that pains us, we can tell what kind of person we are, because a true virtuous person is going to want to do virtuous deeds. They're not going to feel pain to do the right thing. They're going to actually feel good about doing the right thing. And then in chapter 3, Aristotle brings up Plato, and he just says that this right here is the definition of what a good education is. It's teaching children what to enjoy and what to feel pain from, directing them to become a good person. And he compares this to what like a statesman or a lawmaker does for his community, at least in an ideal world. Like, our leaders should be trying to grow a nation of good, decent people. I think that's something that most of us could probably agree with even today. We grow up motivated by pleasure, so it's the hardest thing to control. And he goes, on this account, therefore, pleasure and pain are necessarily our main concern, since to feel pleasure and pain rightly or wrongly has a great effect on conduct. Which, the thing that stands out to most to me is, for Aristotle, there is a right and a wrong way to feel pain and pleasure. So you could take pleasure in doing evil things, and that just makes that you an evil person. You got to actively cultivate from a young age the ability to take pleasure in what Aristotle would term the right things, virtuous conduct. And it reminded me also of something that we would talk about frequently whenever I was knocking on doors, which is that you've got to learn how to love the grind. If you are going to get good at doing something, you need to enjoy doing it. Virtue, like art, is constantly dealing with what is harder, since the harder the task, the better the success. Again, Aristotle is telling us to do the hard thing. And Aristotle starts talking about intention in the 4th chapter, distinguishing virtues from the arts. So, acts are only virtuous if they follow 3 traits. They're done in a certain state of mind. You've got to be aware of what you're doing. You need to deliberately choose it. And then they need to spring from a permanent disposition of character, which means it needs to be authentic. You need to do it intentionally, and it needs to be purposeful. And then in chapter 4, he goes on to distinguish these things from the soul. And he says that there's 3 aspects of the soul. One are the emotions. These are the things that compel us and drive us. And that's different from virtues, because virtues don't drive us. Then he distinguishes them from capacities or potential, which I'm sure I've stuck in relationships for way past their expiration date because of somebody's potential before. Potential's not virtue. So virtues are part of your dispositions or character, your habits. They're a way of actually being and actively living in your life. And then he spends a good portion of the book doing like actual math to demonstrate that we need to only judge ourselves in comparison to ourselves. So a saintly figure, you're not going to measure up to them, so don't even try. You need to just try to focus on being better than who you were yesterday. And day by day, you're going to get better and better. That's actually a quote that we would say before we went knocking on doors. Day by day, getting better and better. He goes on defining most virtues as being the mean between excess and deficiency, although some things are plain good, like justice, and others are plain evil, like adultery. Still, in general, the observance of the mean in fear and confidence is courage. So being too cowardly makes you a coward, but being too reckless just makes you an idiot. And then he goes on to say that in regards to giving and getting money, the observance of the mean is liberality. The excess and deficiency are prodigality, meanness. The prodigal man exceeds in giving and is deficient in getting, whereas the mean man exceeds in getting and is deficient in giving. And that's a lot of complicated stuff, but he's just saying there are, even when it comes to being charitable and being what we would call a Scrooge-like person, there is a perfect median between the extremes. And that's really how we should judge ourselves and our characters. Few takeaways from this. As always, it's surprisingly relevant. I think a lot of these concepts we could all recognize in our own lives. And I've been surprised by just how readable a text that was written by somebody 3,000 years ago has been. Some passages of it are definitely dense and like what you think of when you think of philosophy, but there are a ton of one-liners that you just rip out and it's still just as powerful today. So it always reminds me of just how universal our humanity is, and how the same troubles and trials that we go through in our current lives are the exact same experiences lived by people 1,000 years ago. I mean, we may have iPhones, but at the end of the day, we're still running the software that's stored in the human brain, right? Or, as Aristotle would call it, our soul. And then finally, from this chapter, it's just all about actions, active. So to be a virtuous person, you got to be an active, and you need to be part of the social life, and then your actions consistently create your character, or ethos, which is also the Greek root word for ethical. So again, it's a practical philosophy. That's really all I've got for you guys today. We will be in Nashville for the next 7 days or so, and I really like the skating trails here. It's really nice. The weather is not as hot as it was in Alabama, but I'm sure that it's going to be even cooler as I get further north towards the end of the month. As always, this is your favorite aspiring revolutionary, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. What are you guys doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your communities today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part. You can count on me to do mine daily. Till next time, I love y'all.